A forest breathes. Not the forest you imagine. Not the wild, majestic thing from nature documentaries. This is something else, something quieter and more disturbing. 9,000 years ago. The air hangs wet and heavy with rot. Fruit lies everywhere, soft and dark, split open against the earth. The smell is almost unbearable. Sweet. Putrid. Alive. A wasp lands on one of these fruits. It drinks. Sips the liquid pooling in the split skin. Then it flies away, but not quite. The flight pattern breaks. A stagger. A wobble. It crashes into a leaf, clings to it. Somewhere above, a bird does something a bird should never do. It loses altitude. Recovers. Loses it again. It lands on a branch, tilts its head at an angle that seems broken. From deeper in the forest, a group of early humans watches this happen. They watch for days. For weeks, perhaps. They see wasps and birds and small animals repeatedly visiting the same fallen fruit. They see these creatures change. Become clumsy. Become still. And they watch long enough to wonder. Then one of them, we will never know which one, tastes it. What happens next is not a discovery. It is something far stranger. An invitation. A recognition. A door opening in the mind that was already built before the door itself existed. The assumption collapses. Most people believe they know this story. Most people picture a clever caveman. Leather. Fire. Ingenuity. A moment of human brilliance when someone figured out fermentation and thought, "Today, I invented happiness." We imagine civilization as this procession of clever ideas, one after another, each one a triumph of human creativity. Beer? Another win for human ingenuity. But this is almost certainly wrong. Not wrong in the details. Wrong in the fundamental architecture of what you think happened. The story of alcohol is not a human story at all. It is not about someone finding something. It is about something finding us. And the real timeline, the one that actually happened, stretches back so far that it should make you genuinely uncomfortable. The deep time problem. 10 million years ago. Hold on to that number. Not 10,000. Not 100,000. 10 million. An age so distant that language fails. An age when your ancestors were not yet fully human. Not yet anything you would recognize as ape. Somewhere in the African forests, in this animal you shared with gorillas and chimpanzees, something genetic shifted. A mutation appeared. It wasn't dramatic. No explosion. No sudden change. Just a single modification in the code that builds enzymes. One small alteration to a protein responsible for breaking down alcohol. And with this alteration, your ancestors suddenly became 40 times more efficient at processing ethanol than almost any other animal on Earth. 40 times. The question most people never ask is the one that matters. Why would evolution build this? Evolution does not waste energy. It does not invest in capabilities that have no use. Every mutation that survives does so because it solves a problem. Because it increases the likelihood of survival. Because it answers a need that exists in the world right now, not someday, not theoretically. Right now. So there was a need. A pressing biological need. For an enzyme that could break down alcohol. This suggests something unsettling. It suggests that alcohol was already present in your ancestors' environment in quantities significant enough that evolution deemed it worth the metabolic investment to process it efficiently. Not once. Not by accident. Enough that the animals who could break it down survived better than those who couldn't. Enough that this capability became written into the genetic code of every primate that descended from that moment. Which means alcohol did not come to humans through human cleverness. Humans came to alcohol through an inheritance no one remembers receiving. The ecological trap. At the precise moment this mutation appeared, something else was happening. The climate was changing. The great African forests were transforming. Trees were becoming less available. The branches that had held your ancestors' safe were no longer enough. Gradually, over generations, the forests gave way to savannas. The great descent began. Your lineage, improbably, came down from the trees and walked onto the open ground. On the ground, there was food the trees had not offered. Fallen fruit. Overripe. Fermented. Sitting in the heat and beginning a molecular transformation, the conversion of sugar into alcohol. In a dense forest where visibility was limited and finding food required constant searching, fermented fruit had an advertisement your ancestors could smell from far away. The fermentation created a scent signature. Unmistakable. Impossible to ignore. And these fruits did something else. They contained more digestible sugars than fruit still hanging on the branch. For an animal living on the edge of caloric survival, this meant the difference between hunger and satiation. between weakness and strength, between reproduction and sterility. So your ancestors ate the fermented fruit. Repeatedly. Systematically. Season after season, generation after generation. And each time they did, their bodies, already primed by that ancient mutation, processed the alcohol they consumed. Each time, a small hit of intoxication. Each time, the feeling of fullness and safety that came afterward. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something biochemical began to happen inside their brains. The neural pathways started to associate the smell of fermented fruit with reward, with safety, with survival itself. The brain, that ancient part responsible for basic survival, began to encode alcohol as a signal of something good, something to seek, something that meant, this is a place where you will not starve. Your brain learned to crave it. Not because your brain was broken, because your brain was working exactly as it should. It was learning, associating the smell and taste of a chemical with the most fundamental human need, remaining alive. Evolution had set a trap. And then it had left the trap unlocked for millions of years, waiting for the day something clever enough to make alcohol intentionally would walk the earth. The name for the trap. Researchers call it the drunken monkey hypothesis. The name seems almost whimsical, like someone was making a joke. But the scientist who first proposed it, Robert Dudley, observing actual primates in actual forests, was not joking. He was describing something that looks, from the outside, ridiculous. Monkeys staggering, stumbling, apparently intoxicated. But from the inside, from the evolutionary perspective, it makes a kind of terrifying sense. It is not a bug in the system. It is a feature. The animals that could smell the fermented fruit from farther away survived better. The animals that were drawn to it ate more reliably. The animals whose bodies could process the alcohol efficiently suffered fewer toxic effects. Each advantage, small as it was, accumulated across countless generations. What emerged was an animal, your ancestor, that was not accidentally attracted to alcohol. It was designed to be. Built by millions of years of unconscious selection pressure. Crafted by the slow sculpture of survival itself. Your craving for alcohol is not a human discovery or invention. It is a message written in your neurobiology. A message that reads, this is food. This is safety. This is life. The message has been traveling through time since before your species existed. And it found its audience the moment humans learned to replicate what nature had been offering all along. The moment of awakening. 9,000 years ago. China. A Neolithic village called Jiahu. Archaeologists, in 2004, examined pottery shards that had survived 9 millennia of time. They analyzed them with chemical precision. What they found was not surprising, it should have been, but it was not. Chemical residues. Unmistakable markers of fermented beverage. Not once. Not as an accident. The residues appeared in multiple vessels. In patterns suggesting systematic production. Rice. Honey. Fruit. Deliberately combined. Deliberately allowed to ferment. Deliberately produced, over and over, with the kind of consistency that speaks not to accident, but to knowledge. Humans had figured it out. Before they had figured out how to write their own names, humans had figured out how to manufacture the thing their biology had been waiting for since before language. Before the wheel. Before agriculture itself. Before civilization had any architecture at all. The lock and key had finally met. The spreading pattern. This was not isolated. 8,000 years ago, the evidence shows the same pattern appearing in Georgia. Fermented grapes. The chemistry of wine embedded in ancient pottery. Months later, or years later, or centuries later, the timeline is maddeningly unclear. The same idea appears in Mesopotamia. Fermented grain. Beer. Different ingredients. Different geography. Different people, separated by mountains and deserts and time, all arriving at the same conclusions simultaneously. Then Mesoamerica. Fermented agave. Fermented corn. Continent after continent. Culture after culture. Independent discovery after independent discovery. Not one group teaching another. Not one brilliant person traveling and sharing the secret. But rather, the same human impulse recurring again and again, in isolation. Like evolution itself was running the same experiment over and over, arriving at the same solution through different starting points. This pattern has a meaning. It means that alcohol production was not some fringe activity. Some rare innovation by an especially clever tribe that would die out without trace. It means that something deeper was happening. Something in human psychology was responding to something in human biology. The hunger was real. The craving was real. The moment it became possible to manufacture what humans had been selected to desire, humans manufactured it. Not out of choice. Out of inevitability. The uncomfortable implication. And here is where the comfortable narrative begins to break apart. Archaeologists have long debated which came first in human history, agriculture or civilization. Which innovation was the foundation upon which everything else was built? They pointed to grain, to bread, to the storage of calories. The theory was elegant. Humans learned to farm grain for bread, and from that stability came villages, cities, law, and the entire apparatus of human culture. But the timing does not quite fit. The evidence for fermented beverage production appears nearly as early as the evidence for systematic grain agriculture. Sometimes earlier. Sometimes in places where you would expect bread to come first, but instead you find the chemical signatures of alcohol. Again and again, the timeline refuses to separate neatly into first bread, then beer. Which has led to a controversial question. A question that most people are trained to dismiss immediately, but which the evidence keeps forcing back into consideration. What if agriculture was built on alcohol, not the other way around? What if humans began to cultivate grains not primarily for bread, but for fermentation? The logic is undeniable. Grain stores naturally ferment. Storage creates the conditions for fermentation. Fermentation creates intoxication. An intoxicating beverage is far harder to produce than bread. It requires understanding of timing, temperature, microbiology. It requires knowledge that had to be accumulated and taught and preserved. What if early humans invested the labor in agriculture not to feed themselves better with bread, but to achieve the intoxication their bodies had been selected to crave for millions of years? What if one of the most transformative moments in human history, the shift from nomadic hunter-gatherer to settled agricultural civilization, was driven not by necessity, but by a desire written into the genetic code? Most scholars reject this hypothesis immediately. It seems absurd. Humans would never restructure their entire existence for alcohol. And yet, the evidence keeps whispering that they might have. The evidence keeps suggesting that the timeline does not work the way we want it to work. The evidence keeps hinting that something we have refused to look at directly might actually be true. The hypothesis remains controversial. Officially, bread remains the dominant theory. But the fact that the hypothesis exists at all should disturb you. It should force you to question what you think you know about why humans did what they did. It should plant a seed of doubt about your own confidence in the narrative you have been told about human progress. The social encryption. But even if agriculture was not built on alcohol, something else was. Something deeper was. Alcohol does something that few other substances do. It modulates the human psyche in very specific ways. It lowers the psychological barriers between strangers. It quiets the parts of the mind that calculate social risk. It reduces cortisol, the stress hormone, in controlled doses. It makes the body chemistry of bonding easier to achieve. When early humans gathered to drink fermented beverage, they were not simply intoxicating themselves. They were fundamentally altering the social chemistry of the group. Tribal hierarchies became softer. Conflict became easier to laugh away. Alliances became easier to form. An us that had been fragmented could become, for an evening, a genuine we. Anthropologists have observed this for decades. Early feasting and drinking rituals were not luxury. They were infrastructure. They were the technology through which early groups formed alliances. They were the mechanism by which trust was built between people who had no reason to trust each other. They were how humans, fundamentally tribal animals suspicious of outsiders, learned to cooperate with other groups. Alcohol was a lubricant for civilization itself. Not the foundation. A lubricant. The thing that made the joints of society work smoothly enough that people did not immediately kill each other when forced into proximity. Think about what this means. At the precise moment humans learned to manufacture alcohol at scale, they also gained access to a tool that made cooperation easier. They gained the ability to reduce social fear chemically. They gained a mechanism for bonding that required no particular reason or explanation, just proximity, fermented grain, and the permission to let down the barriers that kept groups separate. The timing was not coincidental. The technology and the neurochemistry aligned. And from this alignment emerged the possibility of civilization itself. But alcohol did something else too. Something that no one talks about very much. 5,000 years ago, when writing had barely emerged in Egypt and Mesopotamia, when civilization was still finding its shape and form, the warnings began. Ancient Egyptian papyri mentioned caution about beer. Specifically excessive beer. The text described dangers. Addiction. The loss of self-control. The degradation that comes from spending too much time in the intoxicated state. These warnings were not modern inventions. They were not the product of centuries of observation and scientific rigor. They were the immediate response of people who had access to something that could be manufactured at scale, and who very quickly learned that this access came with a cost. Even 5,000 years ago, humans had already learned the lesson that every generation since has had to relearn. Fermentation had given them a tool for bonding and stress relief, but that same tool could be turned into a weapon against themselves. The conversation was ancient. The problem was ancient. The tension between the pleasure and the consequence was written into the human story from the moment the first batch was brewed. And yet people kept brewing. Keep brewing. We'll keep brewing. Because the craving is stronger than the warning. Because the ancient pathway, the one built over millions of years, is more powerful than reason or caution or knowledge of danger. Because your brain, even now, in the modern world, even knowing exactly what alcohol does, still remembers what it was trained to remember, that fermented things means safety. That the smell means food. That the chemical means survival. The lesson is encoded deeper than any warning can reach. So what is this story actually about? It is not about beer. It is not about wine. It is not about ancient pottery shards or chemical analysis or archaeological controversy. It is about the relationship between survival and pleasure. It is about how closely intertwined these two forces are in animal biology. How an adaptation designed to find calories becomes, over evolutionary time, a craving. How a craving encoded in the body becomes, when met by human ingenuity, a ritual. How a ritual becomes culture. How culture becomes so embedded in the fabric of civilization that we forget it has any origin at all. Your ancestors did not discover alcohol. They were already looking for it. They just did not know what they were looking for. They were hunting for something that smelled like fermented fruit. They were seeking something that made their bodies feel sated. They were chasing calories dressed up as pleasure. And when humans finally learned to manufacture alcohol at scale, they were not inventing something new. They were fulfilling an ancient contract. A contract written in the genetic code. A contract that read, "If you ever figure out how to make this, your body will thank you. Your mind will open. Your fear will quiet. Your connection to others will deepen." Evolution had written the invitation. Humans simply RSVP'd. Every time you raise a glass, you are participating in this ancient echo. Not because you chose to be part of the pattern. Because the pattern chose you before you were born. It selected your ancestors. It shaped your neurobiology. It waited millions of years for the day you would emerge and continue the cycle it had set in motion. You are not drinking. You are remembering. On behalf of a creature that walked the forest floor 10 million years ago and learned that fermented fruit meant survival. On behalf of every ancestor who drank because the craving drove them to it. On behalf of every human culture that built civilization partly through the careful management of fermentation and intoxication. You are raising a glass to something much older than you. Something that will outlast you. Something that will, with almost certainty, survive humanity itself. That is the true history of alcohol. Not a discovery. Not an invention. But the slow, patient, inevitable emergence of an ancient desire finally meeting the tools to satisfy it. And the haunting realization that you are not the author of your own choices. You are simply the latest echo of a very, very old sound. Final frame. The forest breathes. Still. After all this time. Still the same. The fruit still falls. The fermentation still happens. The wasps still drink. The birds still stumble. And somewhere in that ancient forest, the pattern continues, unaware that anything has changed. But something has changed. Now there are humans. Now the pattern has been recognized. Now the ancient dance has been translated into ritual and language and culture and civilization. Now the craving that once drove simple survival has become poetry. Celebration. Connection. Meaning. And this is perhaps the strangest part of all. That something so old, so rooted in basic survival, could become something so elaborate, so human, so meaningful. That the ancient biological instruction could be woven into the fabric of human celebration and grief and bonding. That we could take this primitive inheritance and transform it into something that feels like choice. That we could drink and feel free, while actually being very, very ancient indeed. End of script.